It's great to welcome to the program today Zenta Brice, who is a Soviet-born journalist and author currently living in France. She's recently published her first book in English called Eagle in the Fridge about the end of the Cold War era when the Soviet Union ultimately did fall apart. Zenta, it's so interesting to speak to you. Personally, I've read so much historical fiction that centers around the last years of the Cold War era and the Soviet Union. But we never know whether we're really getting an accurate picture of what it was like to live in the former Soviet Union at that time. So I guess let me generally open up the floor to you to tell us a little bit of what you think is usually missing from a Western understanding of living in the former Soviet Union.
When I read books about Soviet Union written by Westerners, my vision about it's outsiders. It's always outsiders' view, because we all have stereotypes, and Cold War era created stereotypes both ways, from the Soviet Union to the West, and they were good stereotypes and they were bad stereotypes. And the same happened from the West to the East. So when a Westerner looks, it's always this one united Soviet Union conglomerate of people, the gray, dark, grim faces and all that, but it's not what it was. One thing which for this book is very important, I think, is we must remember that Soviet Union was a very big country and very variable country with a lot of diversity. This book tells the story from the Baltic, from the western end of Soviet Union. If the same story would be written somewhere in Kazakhstan, for example, today, it would be completely different point of view with different traditions, different culture. Diversity was huge, and it's not religious only. It's basically, imagine today's refugees coming out from Syria and sitting in New York. That was the difference between, let's say, West and East parts of Soviet Union. So my point in this book is just only this one little bit. It's Western, it's Baltic states, it's Latvia, where it's happening.
When we think about day-to-day life in the last years of the Soviet Union, and we think about the sort of caricatures and stereotypes that often exist in the West in terms of, empty grocery stores and lines for the most basic food supplies, etc., how much of that portrayal is accurate?
Absolutely. That's absolutely correct, because it's how it happened. But we must point out that we were not exactly starving, and empty grocery shops didn't mean that we are starving, because it was, which is also portrayed in the book, it was something similar we would call a black market. It was exchange, car mechanic exchange with a butcher, services to the products. They simply, the main problem was money had no value, because the last years Soviets were printing more and more and more money. Probably for a Westerner, it's rather hard to realize that you have purse full of money and no goods to buy. And for me, that was the biggest shock when we turned the cards and become a Western country. Suddenly you have plenty of goods, but no money.
Right. I'm guessing, Zenta, that this varied. And again, in your book, Eagle in the Fridge, you're talking about one aspect of the Soviet Union, talking about Latvia. Can you talk a little bit about media freedom, law enforcement, sort of independence and morality, courts, etc.? Some of these issues that when you evaluate a country, the way that, for example, the Human Rights World Report might evaluate a country. What was the situation in the Soviet Union when it came to political dissidents, media freedom, etc.?
Media freedom up to 87, 88, in some parts 89, was non-existent. Simply forget about it. It's not such a thing as media freedom. I think the Baltic states first started 87, when a little bit of realistic information. See, Soviet media was full of propaganda. It was just propaganda and nothing else. First sign of freedom was when private ads started to appear, like marriages, apartment exchanges, private little sales of something. It was the first signs that media is getting a bit more. Before it was always how much harvested, the heroic farmers, heroic heavy machinery doing something, and of course the party's political propaganda, but nothing realistic was in the media.
And Zenta, would you say, can you assess how much of the population would see that propaganda and the sort of cheering of how great everything is going in terms of harvesting or whatever else? How many people believed it in total? How many people did not believe a word of it? How many were somewhere in between?
It's very hard to assess. I would say in bigger cities, Baltic states, Moscow, Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, all these big places, information was circulating through the rumors. It was very weird, but it was the main source of information about what's really going on. So people were well aware. Nobody actually, by that point, I would say that half of the population didn't take serious anything what was going on main media, because you can see, even if whatever your ideology is, you can see that empty shops don't match with all these production victories.
Right.
So we had a very huge and very successful bed of jokes. It was, everybody was surviving on jokes, joke after joke, and most of them were political.
You've described people standing in lines without knowing what the lines were for, sort of under the assumption that if there's a line, it must be worth standing in line for. Can you talk a little bit about that, and also what some of those lines were for?
Line can happen for absolutely everything. It was very little which was, again, in Baltic states. In Baltic states, you go in the shop, it's sunflower oil, some canned fish, usually in sunflower oil, sardines or something like that, and then bread. That was no basic minimum which was in the shops. Lard, probably some other things that normally people don't eat. But the rest was queues, and people were queuing up in hopes that, let's say today, in the butcher's magazine will appear, the delivery van will appear with something, with meat, with sausages, with maybe even salami, and people were standing for hours. I remember my grandmother was doing full-time job, just screening shops daily. She went out in the morning and then came back in the afternoon, and sometimes she came back with something, sometimes with nothing, but it was her daily job just to go around shops and try to find something.
And Zenta, in this environment, was there trust between neighbors and the people, or was there a lack of trust in terms of, hey, maybe I can get something for myself if I report on a neighbor, for example?
Reporting was not popular, at least in Baltic states. We were a bit like it's them and it's us. So reporting was not so popular. and reporting never brought you like kilogram of best venison. It always was more subtle. Let's say if you are a scientist and if you want to go to the foreign conference somewhere, road will be linked with your ability to report. But it wasn't very. One thing the KGB used, and it may sound very weird today, gays. By the law, Soviet law, the gay can be punished, lesbian wasn't. And gays were living normally, nobody were running after them, but if there was a need, the law was used to turn the gay people into KGB reporters. Yeah, that was one thing. And I think current phobia in Russia also is a bit linked with that, like, let's keep gay people bad boys.
Right.
It's interesting how information and perception can be used for political needs.
Absolutely. Well, listen, I highly recommend the book Eagle in the Fridge. It is Zenta Brice's book about the end of the Cold War era and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. Zenta, thanks so much for talking to us about this, and I'm glad we were able to make it work.
Thank you for letting me speak. I'm very happy. Thank you.